We are in the 38th installment of the life of Jesus. Last week we talked about the feeding of the 5,000, at least that's how it's usually labeled in your Bible. It's more like the feeding of the 10 to 15,000 by the time you include everybody. We'll keep calling it that because that's what reminds us typically, because that's what we've heard it called. That's the last thing we saw. Jesus fed the 5,000. We are picking up from that point, and we are pulling today from Matthew 14, Mark 6, and John 6. Then Jesus, because he knew they were going to come and seize him by force to make him king, immediately made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, past Bethsaida, while he dispersed the crowds. Now when evening came, after Jesus said goodbye to them and sent the crowds away, he went up the mountainside by himself to pray. So last week we talked about how the crowds were associating Jesus with Moses. They saw him as this new prophet. He did this multiplication of food like happened for Moses in the wilderness in Exodus. So we left with them going, oh, this is really cool. He's an amazing prophet. And then we see it very quickly transitioned into, why don't we make him king? And I suspect this was one of the reasons Jesus often told people to keep what he was doing on the down low. He wasn't ready to be the kind of king they wanted. In fact, he wasn't there to be the kind of king they wanted. They were expecting this king who was going to come with a sword, was going to kick Rome out of the area, establish their own kingdom, and that's not just what Jesus was going to do. In fact, if you were here during the Revelation series, you might remember that Jesus is portrayed with a sword, but it's a sword that comes out of his mouth, and it's just his word. It's the truth of the gospel. That's the mean that he combats evil and the means with which evil will ultimately be defeated. So Jesus disperses the crowds, not quite sure how he did it, but he managed to get them to leave him and not try to make him king. His disciples started to cross the lake to Capernaum, and it had already become dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. By now, strong wind was blowing and the sea was getting rough. Meanwhile, the boat, already far from land in the middle of the sea, was taking a beating from the waves. And that word there isn't just like, oh, it was some serious rocking. It's more like they were getting thrashed in the middle of the sea. Jesus was alone on the land and saw them straining at the oars because the wind was against them. And I'll just note, Jesus keeps sending his disciples into storms, and we're going to come back to that later. When the night was ending, and they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, this is out of probably a 5 to 6 mile journey, they caught sight of Jesus walking on the lake, approaching the boat, for he wanted to pass by them. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost," and they cried out with fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, "Have courage, it's I, do not be afraid." That phrase, by the way, in the original language sounds a lot like Jesus saying, "I am," which goes back to Exodus and which John talks about a lot. And Peter said, "Lord, if it's you, order me to come to you on the water." So Jesus said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind, he became afraid, and starting to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they went up into the boat, the wind ceased. And then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." And they were completely astonished, because they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hard. The image there isn't necessarily like they made their hearts hard. More, if you go back to the parable of the sower, like the seed of truth just wasn't landing well in their hearts because at least parts of their heart were hard soil. And they were glad to take him into the boat. I'll bet they were. And immediately the boat came to the land where they had been heading. All right, they had probably been rowing for about 6 hours out there on the ocean. They're maybe 2/3 of the way to where they're going. And Jesus catches up with them, and according to the time frame, it's between 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the morning. Like dawn is just breaking for them. And the Bible does not record that the disciples were afraid of the storm this time. What they were afraid was when they thought they saw a ghost walking toward them on the water. And that makes sense to me, because if I was out fishing and someone came walking across the water to me, I would panic. But Jesus identifies himself, and they relax. And then Peter basically says, okay, prove it. And you'd think by this time they're starting to wrap their mind around the idea that Jesus is the Messiah and he does really miraculous things. I mean, they've seen it's the water to the wine, it's healing the sick, bringing people back from the dead, casting out demons. He calmed one storm with a word. He just fed 10,000 people by creating something from nothing. But you get the impression here that Peter, it's not enough. Peter needs another sign. And we'll come back to the language later of that. It just wasn't landing in his heart and taking root well. He wants another sign. And so only one gospel records Peter walking on the water. The other two gospels just say Jesus came out, got in the boat, and took them to land. And one thing that tells me is that the story is not about Peter. The story is about Jesus. Peter's in the story, and we're going to talk about some lessons I think we can apply from this story to our lives. But the story is about Jesus. And one thing we learned about Jesus is that he will, in fact, give Peter another sign. We've talked about this before. Like, Jesus keeps saying, oh, you need another sign. And then he gives another sign. Like, even as he desires for people to believe he is who he said he is, when they express doubt or they feel like they need to see something else, Jesus very patiently continues to reveal himself. And now I'm thinking of when Jesus told the disciples they needed to feed these 5,000, and the disciples talk about it, and they basically conclude, it's impossible. Jesus knew that. He's just kind of setting them up to acknowledge the situation that we're in. We see no earthly way it can be fixed. And that makes me think of when he healed, or he brought the one guy's daughter back to life, and he goes to the house where they're mourning, and he's like, she's just asleep. And they start insisting, no, she's dead. So that when he raises her, they can't go back and go, she was just asleep. Like they'd all testified, we're in an impossible situation. And I think Jesus does this to help people recognize that where they are, they're not capable of solving the problem. And I think he's just prepping opportunities to show his credentials as the Messiah. And I think we're going to see it here as well. So we get Peter asking to walk on water. Now, I don't know if Peter had considered a plan B. Like, they thought it was a ghost, and Jesus says, I'm not a ghost. And Peter's like, are you sure? Can you prove it? And so Jesus, or a ghost, if you're Peter, says, come out on the water. And I have to wonder I don't know what Peter was thinking, like, maybe I'm a good swimmer, and if this doesn't work out, I'll just climb back in the boat. Peter wasn't really known for his level-headedness. Like, if you've read the Gospels before, he really steps in it quite a bit of the time. Anyway, Peter steps out of the boat, and he tries to walk on the water, and he fails. And it's interesting, up until that point, the Bible doesn't record that Peter was worried about the wind. Now, suddenly, Peter's out there, and now he's worried about the wind. And I was thinking about this. I'm not quite sure how you'd walk on water if you're a person in a raging storm. So I've been down to the open space. Am I pointing in the right direction? Okay, good. I've been down to the open space when it's really stormy. Have any of you been down there? I remember one time we were sitting in the parking lot, and the waves were so big, they were crashing into the parking lot and over our van. It was majestic and terrifying. And I'm trying to envision, if I had the ability to walk on water, I can envision two scenarios. One is like, I am surfing these monstrous waves, and that's just disastrous. The other is like, I'm walking on level ground in some sense, but now all the waves are crashing over me, and that's disastrous. Like, I'm not even sure what Peter was thinking would happen. Most of the pictures you see of Jesus was like, where Jesus is walking, he has calmed the storm, which he did in the previous storm, right? So like, it's all chill around Jesus. Maybe Peter thought that would happen. There's a lot the text doesn't say. But I am really curious what Peter was thinking would happen. I don't know. But he starts sinking when he realizes he bit off a bit more than he could chew. And then he does the right thing. And I don't often hear this talked about in the story, but he does the right thing. He doesn't even try to swim back in the boat. He calls out to Jesus, which I suspect was going to be the point all along. And so Jesus, of course, saves him. The Bible says immediately Jesus held out his hand. which makes me think Jesus was pretty close. He holds on, he pulls him up. And then he very gently says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And I've heard a lot of sermons, and there's a lot of commentaries that will focus on this story with the sense of, if Peter had not doubted, like if he had kept his eyes on Jesus instead of the wind, he could have walked to Jesus on the water. And I like that image a lot. If nothing else, it points us to the power of worship. Like as we go through difficult things in life, keep your eyes upon Jesus. Some of you might have grown up with this song, "Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face. The things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace." So I like that image from the story because I think there's a point to it. But I don't think it's the primary thing we're supposed to take away from the story, because the story is about Jesus. So let's talk about this a little bit. Book of John. John is writing a book, and if you read about why the four Gospels are different, you'll learn that the writers all had a kind of a different focus. They were writing to a different audience. They were trying to make a different point about Jesus. So they focus on different things, which is one reason we're putting them all together as we go through this series, so we kind of get all the focuses at the same time. But it's worth pointing out that John is the writer of the gospel that really focuses on Jesus' credentials as a Messiah. Here's a quote from an article called "What Makes Each of the Gospels' Accounts Unique?" "This gospel," that's the Gospel of John, "stands out structurally as it lays out in the first chapter. It emphasizes the signs and wonders performed by Jesus during his ministry on earth, rather than just outlining the totality of it." And here's the important part. 7 of these signs are changing water into wine, healing the royal official's son, healing the paralytic, feeding the 5,000, walking on water, healing a man blind from birth, and raising Lazarus from the dead. So those last 2 are coming up. Each of these signs either fulfills a prophecy, demonstrates Jesus' authority, or demonstrates his deity. John focuses on Jesus as the Son of God, the Word at the beginning, and the right ruler of all things. So this story is one of John's 7 signs. And John does not include Peter in his gospel, because Peter's not the point of this story. Jesus is. This is one of the signs of the Messiah. And this goes back to Old Testament text, where there's a thing that God does and nobody else does, and both Job and Psalms record this. He treads on the waves of the sea. And so you see very clearly Jesus fulfilling this. And I think this is part of the Exodus thing we talked about last week. Feeding of the 5,000 reminds the Jewish people of manna in the wilderness from Moses. But Jesus goes, he's the new and better Moses, because Moses needed God to give him something. Jesus creates something from nothing on his own. And now we go back to Exodus. God parts the water for the people of God so they can walk through. Here's God treading on the water. He doesn't need it to be parted so he can stay stable on dry land. He is the Lord of the waves of the sea. And then there's something else happening here that we don't really pick up on in our translations. And I don't know if you thought about it when I read it. It says that Jesus was going to pass them by. And I think for years I had this image in my head of Jesus just like, hey, he's walking. Like, see you guys over there? They're panicking. Jesus is getting a chuckle out of it. And that is not what is happening here. This is reminiscent of language, once again from the Old Testament, of how God reveals his glory. I'll give you 2 examples. The first has to do with Moses. And this is when Moses is up on Mount Sinai. It's the whole story about getting the 10 Commandments. Moses said to God, "Show me your glory." And the Lord said, "I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence." And the Lord said, "There's a place near me where you may stand on a rock, and when my glory passes by, I'll put you in a cleft of the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by." In 1 Kings, this has to do with Elijah. God says, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then there's a wind, and then there's fire, and there's an earthquake, and then there's a whisper, and Elijah hears this and realizes he's in the presence of God. My point with both of those is this language of passing by was not like Jesus going, "See ya." This is Jesus going, "I will cause my glory to pass in front of you so that you can see who I am." So Jesus, as I read it, is walking on the water to proclaim his glory to his disciples, which also makes sense. If he's right by Peter, when Peter steps out, he can pull it up, because Jesus isn't skirting them by half a mile out where they can barely see. Hey, I think he's probably right there. He's displaying his glory for them to see so they know who he is. And as I've been thinking about this, I'm not so sure that Jesus was rebuking Peter for failing to walk on the water as much as he was rebuking Peter for failing to see that he was the Messiah. This has come up over and over again. I mean, Peter keeps testing him. Show me another thing. Show me another thing. And Jesus does it, right? Because he's kind and he's patient. And he does this for Peter. But notice it wasn't Jesus who floated the idea of Peter walking on the water. This was Peter's idea. Think of it as Peter's calling for Peter. I mean, if it had been Jesus calling for Peter, Peter would have walked on the water. But if you look at it, Peter says, and I paraphrase, "Can I walk on the water to see if it's you? If I can do that, I'll know it's you. Tell me to come over." And Jesus is like, "All right, come over." And you know what Peter discovers? That Jesus is the Messiah who can save. Right? I think it's a little bit of a, Peter didn't know what he was getting into, and Jesus was still going to use it to display his glory. And in fact, I think it might have been more important that Peter experienced the up-close saving of Jesus personally and pointedly. Like, that was a necessary thing for him to see. Peter's going to need this later, right? When Peter denies Jesus and leaves in shame, he's going to have to believe there is a Savior who he can see him drowning, in this case in his own sin, and still pull him up because he cares. I have a feeling this was a formative time for Peter. And I've been wondering what it had been like if Peter had actually made it to Jesus and back, walking on the water. Based on what we see of Peter's personality, I suspect he would have been insufferable to live with. Like, "Hey, John, remember that time I alone of all of us walked on the water? You guys remember? Thomas, you want to go storm chasing on the Sea of Galilee?" "No, I'll just walk out there." This is my favorite. "Who wants to play boat, water?" "Peter." Boat takes water, and Peter takes boat and water, and now he doesn't have any friends, and they're all just like, this guy, right? And I'm actually wondering if sinking was a really important part of Peter's spiritual formation. Because very publicly, he failed. Like, very publicly, he stepped out. That's cool. That's amazing that he had the success that he did, so to speak. Because I'm sure they were impressed at first. And then he's flailing, and he's floundering, and he's desperate. And it's very public. And sometimes that's a gift not only to the person who fails, but all the people who would have had to live with that person if they had succeeded. I mean, because Peter's going to go on to be called the Rock. Like, this failure doesn't discount him. Jesus doesn't go, "You know, Peter, at one time, dude, you had your shot, you blew it, I'm finding someone else." It's like, Peter, you're the Rock. And in my mind, I want one of the disciples to be like, "Yeah, he sinks like a stone." And then they all giggle, and Peter turns red, and Peter's reminded of something very important, that Jesus didn't use him because he crushed it. Jesus used him because Jesus crushes it. And he could take people, even in the midst of their failures, and do miraculous things. Because I think the story's always been about the power of Jesus. You all know I like Adam Clark as a commentator. He says this about this passage: "Every moment we stand in need of Christ. While we stand, we are upheld by his power only. When we're falling or have fallen, we can be saved only by his mercy. So let's always take care. We do not consider so much the danger to which we are exposed as the power of Christ by which we are to be upheld." So Jesus identifies himself again. It's clear. He gets back into the boat. This is amazing. He's established his credentials. And that's when you read that the disciples needed this yet again because their hearts had been hard through all the previous things that Jesus had been doing. And it's still, I can find myself being judgmental of the disciples, like, how did you all not get this? But I also have to remember how stunning this proclamation was. But they had seen all those things I had listed before, and the truth still wasn't taking root in some place in their heart. And we're going to circle back to this idea next week because we're going to learn something very interesting about the crowd with the next thing that Jesus has to say. So let's kind of put this heart stance on a shelf and focus on something else for the rest of the morning. So once the watery storms ends for the disciples, there's a lot more storms that come up. They just don't involve water. If you've read the life of the disciples, everything from as we're going through the rest of the Gospels to the book of Acts to their martyrdom, like storms keep coming. And this has always been true, and both Jesus and the writers of Scripture warned this would be the case. Jesus said in John 16, "In this world you will have trouble." And he tells them, "Be of good cheer, I've overcome the world," but that doesn't discount, in the world you'll have trouble. David, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," and you could read that as, "I'll walk through the valley of the shadow of death, but I don't have to fear evil because you're with me." But there'll still be a valley and a shadow. James writes, "Count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds," because you will meet trials. Paul says in Romans 8, "The sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which will be revealed." Awesome, there's sufferings in this present time. Peter wrote in 1 Peter 4, "Don't think it's strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you." Like, we'll get fiery trials, and that won't be weird or unusual. So there'll be storms. And so I want to talk about Peter and us and the storms of life. And once again, it's not because the story is about Peter, but it involves Peter as it points toward Christ. So I just want us to consider a little bit about how we are involved in the storms of our life, what we might expect, and how it points us toward Christ. So there's different kinds of storms. One thing I was thinking of this week, there's just storms of sins that are done to us. And that is things that others do that threaten to drown us. That could be emotionally, mentally, relationally, physically, even spiritually, because sin has a terrible ripple effect. And the greater the sin that's done to us, the more traumatically it's going to land in our lives. And there's actually a lot of good things that keep us afloat. Listen, I've been working on this analogy all week. I'm still not sure it's perfect, but we're going to go with it because it was time to preach, and I didn't have time to work on it anymore. Okay? There's a lot of good things that will keep us afloat in the midst of life storms, and I think these good things are a gift from God that He makes accessible to everybody. That's things like therapy, counseling, spiritual formation, accountability groups, being part of a church community, sometimes medication. I think those are all boats that can kind of keep us floating in the midst of a storm. I think of this as what we call in Christian theology common grace. By common, we don't mean cheap. We simply mean God in His grace has given provision to all people that because these provisions come from God in some fashion, they are helpful. I mean, the disciples went out in the storm in a boat. They weren't making great headway, and they were exhausted, but they weren't at that point sinking. So I just think of common grace as gifts that are accessible to all of us. And I'm going to come back to this later, but I notice in the story, you can row, and you might not be drowning, but you could row in that same storm for years. And the land you're hoping to get to remains elusive. So do you kind of understand what I'm saying? They're helpful things, but they're not the ultimate thing that's going to bring us to the place we need to go. And like we see Peter in this story, at times he's like, "I've got this, let me have a shot at it." Okay, it looks like he got a couple good steps in. And then I think like Peter, we have those moments of success, and then we realize the winds of sin, this storm, we don't have it in ourselves to stay afloat. And we fought so hard, right? We fought so hard. But we've been brought to this place of desperation where we recognize this boat's got leaks, and these waves are crashing, and as much as they were helpful, I'm going to go down, and I'm not going to get to the place where I need to be. And I think it's in that prayer of helpless desperation that Jesus' strong right hand, which was always there, saves us from drowning, and then he gets in the boat with us and guides us to shore. And like I said, a lot of ways I can improve this analogy, but I think it'll work. And I have this image in my head. I wonder what it was like after Peter got in the boat with Jesus. I mean, if I were like Peter, that's got to be a weird roller coaster, just like the stormy waves, like stepped out of the boat and was walking, crushing it. Might have looked back at his buddies like, who's got two thumbs and walks on water? This guy. And then down, and it's humiliating. And does Jesus still believe in you? Does he care? Like, now what do these guys all think? And you're just sitting there. And I have this image in my head. This isn't in the Bible. This is Anthony's image in his head. But I just think about how the Bible portrays Jesus. And I can see Peter just sitting there for a while. And after a while, he turns to Jesus and he says, I tried. And I just see Jesus going, I know. And then he puts his arm around him and he takes him to the other side. And I see Peter going, I just couldn't do it. Like he thought he could. He said, I couldn't do it. And Jesus goes, you didn't need to. It was never the point that you were strong enough. You just had to reach out. And in my head, that's the whole conversation. Nothing else needs to be said. They just sit together. And Peter realizes Jesus still loves him. And they're going to get to the other side. And it'll be okay. And I see Peter just kind of processing this humbling reality that I'm not enough. And then the comforting reality that I don't have to be, because there's somebody else who is. And I was thinking of, that's the sin storm. I'm thinking of relational storms. And so the example I always use is Sheila and I, because that's my closest relationship. For some of you, it's going to be your spouse. For some of you, it's going to be friends, coworkers. I don't know. This can be different for everybody. So I'm just thinking of the storms we've gone through. And man, there were times we were going under and we were trying so hard. And we got the water wings and the life jackets and the snorkeling gear. And by that I mean we read books, we went to conferences, we had counseling, we attended marriage retreats. And they were all good things. And they all kept us afloat for a while and kept us from drowning. And then the wind of our brokenness and the waves of our baggage just crashed and crashed and crashed. And our most transformative moments were in those moments where we were drowning. And all we had left to do was reach out and beg Jesus to get us. And I distinctly remember a very specific time. We looked at each other and we said, what do we do? We're out of ideas. There is no way we can discern or we can fix what's broken in us. And all we had left to do was just pray, like desperation, like God, this demands a miracle or we're lost. And so once again, it's just us through tears going, we tried. And Jesus going, I know. And us going, we don't have the tools to do it. And Jesus says, you don't need to. And I remember in that incident, Sheila and I went home from that supper. We were just two people in despair. The next day we had lunch just to be together because we were committed to just putting one foot in front of the other. We knew kind of what the right thing to do, even if it felt pointless. We just had lunch together. We were done. We were at the Flapjack Shack. I'm probably getting the details wrong. Am I right? Was it the Flapjack Shack? It doesn't matter, does it? We were somewhere, had lunch. Go back, sit in the van. We just listened to a comedian that we both liked so we could laugh together. We didn't talk about life or marriage. In fact, we didn't talk about it at all for a week or two. And then suddenly both of us realized everything had changed. And we actually didn't even have to go back and finish working that out. Everything had changed. There's something about that drowning moment where we reach out in desperation to Jesus, and Jesus goes, I've got you. And he does that miraculous thing that we could never do on our own. And I just don't envision a Jesus who slaps us upside the head for trying so hard on our own power. I think he recognizes we're human. We tried. How'd that go? It didn't work. Okay, now it can. I'm thinking I've been in storms where I think I was a lot like Peter in that I recognized the only way the storm was going to subside and I was going to be safe was when Jesus was in charge. But what I wanted to do, I wanted to walk on water in the midst of Jesus doing his thing. Like, how cool would it be if Jesus fixes this and I look amazing? So let's go back to COVID, everybody's favorite topic. We're trying to navigate our way through it as a church, right? And I'm trying to provide pastoral leadership. And I knew it was going to take a miracle. I want to be clear about this. I knew that it was going to be by the supernatural grace of God we were going to make it through because it was tough times. But honestly, I figured I could probably look amazing while we were doing it. Like, I figured I could walk on COVID water. I just kind of thought, it'll be my wisdom, my compassion, my truth-telling. I'm such a time as this kind of guy. I'll be this bright beacon in a dark world, bring on a wind full of masks and shutdowns and distancing. Like, I will walk on that stormy COVID water as Jesus takes us to the other side. And if you were here, you know how that went. Started sinking pretty fast. Like, all of you were mad at me at some point. I was mad at me at some point. I mean, I might have got a couple steps in if I was lucky, and then just went down. And that's once again me through tears talking to Jesus going, I tried. And Jesus going, I know. And I said, I couldn't do it. And Jesus said, I can. And that was where Jesus and I and you, we're all flailing about in this wind, and he's right there with us, reminding us we'll get through the storm, not because any of us were amazing, but because Jesus is amazing. And he pulled me back up, and he pulled you back up, and he put us all together in this boat called CLG, and he took us to where we needed to go. Right? And this church has gone through storms in its 50 years. And how many times in those 50 years did either those of us in leadership or those of us who were attending were just like, we got this. Yes, Jesus will take us there, but watch this. And we step out of the boat, and it's just a matter of time before that whirlpool opens up and we all just get sucked down and taken to that place where we go, oh, dear God, we cannot survive this storm unless you help us. And you know what he's done over and over for 50 years in CLG? Pulls us back up, not because we're amazing, but because he's amazing. And then he puts us back in this boat. And I just want to comment about this. With Peter, Jesus didn't pull an Oprah and go, walking on the water for you, walking for the water on. I mean, he could have just taken the boat away, walked them all to shore. How amazing would that have been? He didn't. He didn't even walk Peter to shore. He puts him back in the boat. There's something about that that just sticks in my head. And I don't think this was the point of the story, but I think it's an analogy that may be important. All those things I mentioned earlier, the common grace gifts of God, one of which is a church, community, and family. They're all boats, and they're all boats in which Jesus takes us important places. And just to be clear, it's not the boat itself that will save us. It's when Jesus tells us to get into this particular boat, and then he goes with us to the other side. Right? It's in that kind of thing, a part of God's provision and plan. He, just like he used the disciples to disperse his miracle of food, he uses these boats to help take us to the places that he is taking us in the midst of it. And this just brings me back to what I love about Jesus. He's a Messiah who does not abandon us in the midst of storms. He doesn't reject us when we fail to see him clearly. He doesn't despise us when we're too weak. He's just always there. He's always holding out his hand. He's always offering to save us. He's always giving us boats of common grace and getting into them with us so that we go where he intends for us to go. And it's in this we see his glory and his faithfulness over and over again. Lord, I thank you that you cause your glory to pass in front of us. May we never mistake it for something else. May we see it clearly. And may we be the kind of people who sooner rather than later cry out to you, the only one who has the power and authority and majesty of a God, and who loves us and is merciful and is kind and is gracious, and who leads us to Christ, who draws us into his family. And who just loves us.